Pictures at 13. A marked change in direction after the Second World War. Spy force post-Second World War. There are many secret service departments, but the one most dominant and involved with the many others, of course, is the CIA. It is the successor of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, formed during the Second World War to coordinate espionage activities behind enemy lines for the branches of the United States military. Currently a budget of more than $80 billion a year, with 16 agencies all having communication with the CIA, and the money spent on military purposes is more than the European countries put together to maintain American dominance. The US is not prepared to rein in its debts for the sake of its own people by pulling back on the money spent in military operations around the world. Any country that adopts a policy of nationalisation of industries and collectivisation, socialism, has been and will be under threat. Its dominance is through companies it owns throughout the world, and wars against those which it cannot influence in the name of democracy or freedom. Ralph McGee, former CIA man, retired with the CIA recommendations in '77, tells us something of the nature of the beast. The CIA is not now or never has been a central intelligence agency. It is the covert action arm of the President's foreign policy advisors. In that capacity, it overthrows or supports foreign governments while reporting intelligence, justifying those activities. It shapes its intelligence even in such critical areas as Soviet nuclear weapon capability to support presidential policy. Disinformation is a large part of its covert action responsibility, and the American people are the primary target audience of its lies. Psychic driving, breaking down the subject's personality. The topic of psychic driving is dealt with in some detail in the docudrama entitled The Sleeping Room, directed by Anne Wheeler. The psychic driving procedure was a chronological precursor to the Canadian doctor Cameron's depatterning, the latter involving massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy combined with similarly large doses of psychedelic drugs such as LSD. The intent was to break down the subject's personality. Suspicion. Operation UK Ultra. Inspired by North Korea's brainwashing program, the CIA began experiments on mind control. The most notorious part of this subject involved giving LSD and other drugs to American subjects without their knowledge or against their will, causing several to commit suicide. However, the operation involves far more than this. This was funded in part by Rockefeller, Ford Foundation. Research includes propaganda, brainwashing, public relations, advertising, hypnosis, and other forms of suggestion. See those areas that they put together there. How does Satan appear and how does he talk? As an angel of light, but it is of darkness. 2 Corinthians 11:14. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is of no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. There's a pretense that we're working for the good of the common people, or doing charitable things, or the end justifies the means. How does he speak? He said to Adam and Eve, "You won't surely die," but his intention was to destroy. Isaiah 14 verse 4. That thou should take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how has the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased. In the same chapter, speaking to the king of Babylon, he also then speaks of that which is behind the king of Babylon, Lucifer. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? So as he speaks about a nation, he also makes reference to Lucifer. In Revelation 13, it's talking about fire coming down in the sight of men. It's speaking of the nation, and it's talking directly of Lucifer appearing on earth as the Christ and bringing down fire in the sight of men. November 22, 1963 JFK assassination. Shortly after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, John F. Kennedy said, "Something very bad is going on within the CIA and I want to know what it is. I want to shred the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the four winds." His death shortly followed. John Hunt, a few years and months before his death, he disclosed to his son through audio recordings, discussions and through writings that he and several others were involved in the conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy. He gave the code name for the conspiracy operation as the Big Event. He gave the names of others involved, but his allegations were not officially investigated or proven as such. He died in 2007 in Miami, Florida, and in his memoirs you can see that he was involved in the CIA, Watergate, and the overthrow of Latin American countries. Any form of mind control that uses the will is against God's intention. The mind is the governing power of man for salvation. The will is by which we make a decision for or against God. The theory of mind-controlling mind was originated by Satan to introduce himself as the chief worker, to put human philosophy where divine philosophy should be. Of all the errors that are finding acceptance among professedly Christian people, none is more dangerous deception, none more certain to separate man from God than this. Innocent though it may appear, if exercised upon patients, it will tend to their destruction, not to their restoration. It opens a door through which Satan will enter to take possession both of the mind that is given up to be controlled by another and of the mind that controls. Propaganda. Edward Bernays, the engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process. What an interesting twist. The freedom to persuade and suggest. His book, of course, here on the right, by the very name Propaganda. In his 1965 autobiography, Bernays recalls a dinner at his home in 1933 where Karl von Wergenand, foreign correspondent of the Hertz newspaper, an old hand at interpreting Europe and just returned from Germany, was telling us about Goebbels and his propaganda plans to consolidate Nazi power. Goebbels had shown Wergenand his propaganda library, the best Wergenand had ever seen. What was found there in the library was this book by Bernays, crystallizing public opinion as a basis for his destructive campaign against the Jews of Germany. This shocked me. Obviously, the attack on the Jews of Germany was no emotional outburst of the Nazis, but a deliberate, planned campaign. Use of propaganda against God's people. The same masterful mind that plotted against the faithful in ages past is still seeking to rid the earth of those who fear God and obey his law. All who in that evil day would fearlessly serve God according to the dictates of conscience will need courage, firmness, and a knowledge of God and his word, for those who are true to God will be persecuted. Their motives will be impugned, their best efforts misinterpreted, and their names cast out as evil. Wealth, genius, education will combine to cover them with contempt. Persecuting rulers, ministers, and church members, family members will conspire against them. With voice and pen, by boast, threats, and ridicule, they will seek to overthrow their faith. Defining the New America. Bernays' celebration of the propaganda helped define public relations, but it did not win the industry many friends. If you can influence the leaders, perhaps even the leaders of countries, either with or without their conscious cooperation, you automatically influence the group which they sway. Bernays is Sigmund Freud's nephew. May 23, 1997. The truth is told about 54. Bernays' work, a strategic mind game against USA citizens in Guatemala. First democratically elected president. America controls the agriculture through the United Food Company, and they sell to America and Europe. America controls the railways and telecommunications. Government sanctions a fake media allowed by the American government to make false allegations, and that fake media feeds the American mainstream media. Media trips from America are directed to those with anti-government sentiments as they visit Guatemala. Roman Church uses its intelligence and calls the people to rise up. There is an uprising amongst the military. CIA bombs the country. President Nixon is shown fake evidence of communist material at the overthrow. Investigations by the USA show that this operation was flawed and done purely in American interest. Well, I think this one's a pretty good one for Nixon. Those interested in overthrowing the people's choice. Several hundred records were released by the CIA on May 23, 1997, on its involvement in the '54 coup in Guatemala. They reflected Truman's administration feeling on the government of Arbenz, elected in 1950, and will continue a process of socio-economic reforms that the CIA disdainfully referred to as an intensely nationalistic program of progress coloured by the touchy anti-foreign inferiority complex of the Banana Republic. CIA and IC report tended to support the view that Guatemala and Arbenz regime were rapidly falling under the sway of communism. They believed the situation called for action. Their assessment was that without help, Guatemalan opposition would remain inept, disorganized, and inefficient, so they had to help it. The anti-communist elements, the Catholic hierarchy, landowners, business interests, the Railway Workers' Union, university students, and the army were prepared to prevent a communist ascension to power, but they had little outside support. Our friend here, Mario, the Spanish Cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, who served as Archbishop in the Guatemala City from 1964 until his death, was elected to Cardinal in 1969. So we're talking about after the overthrow of the Arbenz government. The Cardinal was an ardent supporter of the Guatemala regime, so much so that his automobile was accompanied by a radio patrol and 2 armed motorcycle guards in response to the murder of many politically active missionaries. Guatemala Jesuit Spellman CIA. The Catholic Church is told to rise up against the government several months before the coup. Intelligence is passed along by the Jesuits to the CIA. Spellman, who was involved on the Vietnam War, also directs American Catholic support for the war against this country. Looking at the results, Operation PB History. After the campaign, the CIA sent a handful of agents to Guatemala in order to gather and analyze government documents that would, amongst other things, find evidence that would support the CIA's belief that the Guatemalan were rising Soviet puppet state in an operation that was known as Operation PB History. Despite amassing well over 150,000 pages, they found very little to substantiate the key premise of the invasion. US-backed death squads in South and Central America. Guatemala has had death squads active since the 1960s up through to the 1990s. Historian Greg Gandin. Guatemala's former dictator, Efren Montt, had been convicted of genocide in the slaughter as many as 200,000 members of the indigenous groups during the 1980s in a long, bloody fight against the left. But little was said at the trial about the US involvement in Guatemala. A United Nations Truth Commission in 1999 said the United States bore much of the responsibility for advising, training, arming, financing the troops, even teaching torture, as part of the Reagan administration campaign against communism. So the war in Guatemala has continued from the various early times post-Second World War up to this very time now, and the country's wealth and opportunities has been taken from it. But these things are happening on a worldwide scale at this point of time. Let's have a look at the economic effects on these countries of Latin America. It's an example for us of where we're going. It's an example to the West, and it's happening there at this very moment. There's unrest everywhere. The rule of the market, liberating free enterprise or private enterprise from any bonds imposed by the government, the state, given into the hands of the private bankers and the wealthy, cutting public expenditure for social services like education, healthcare, privatisation of those things which were a safety net in case there would be a depression, or for the poor, reducing the safety net for the poor and even the maintenance of roads, bridges, water supply. There's deregulation, privatisation, sell state-owned enterprises, goods and services to private investors. This includes banks, key industry, railways, toll, highway, electricity, schools, hospitals, and even fresh water. And even though it's done in the name of greater efficiency, privatisation has concentrated the wealth into the hands of a few and making the public pay even more for its needs. Around the world, what's called, what we're describing here, neoliberalism, has been imposed by powerful financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and Inter-America Development Bank. It is raging all over Latin America. I'd say it's raging all over the world. The first clear example of neoliberalism at work was in Chile after the CIA-supported coup against the poorly elected Allende regime in '73. Other countries followed, with some of the worst effects in Mexico, with wages declined 40-50% in the first year of NAFTA, while the cost of living rose by 80%. Over 20,000 small and medium businesses have failed, and more than 1,000 state-owned enterprises have been privatized in Mexico. As one scholar said, neoliberalism means the neo-colonization of Latin America. A very clever ploy and very well thought out, and I would say that this is of Vatican and American interest as far as the finances and the control of these countries worldwide. The Jesuit is to appear as all things to all men. But in it, Ignatius gives this advice to his followers: nor will it contribute a little to our advantage if with caution and secrecy we foment and heighten the animosities that arise amongst princes and great men, even to such a degree that they may weaken each other. But if there appear any likelihood of reconciliation, then as soon as possible let us endeavour to be mediators, lest others prevent us. They have a very unique tactic, that is, allowing war between opposite parties, pretending to be mediators while fueling animosities. Therefore, in this wise they shall work, while petitioning and speaking up against neoliberalism, privatization, globalist effects. They are the very ones orchestrating the globalization effort, holding the purse strings of the Bank of America. Liberation theology, which is fashioned and used by the Jesuits, is a movement in Christian theology which interprets the teaching of Jesus Christ in terms of liberation from unjust economic, political, or social conditions. It has been described by proponents as an interpretation of Christian faith through the poor's suffering, their struggle and hope, and a critique of society and the Catholic faith and Christianity through the eyes of the poor, and by detractors as Christianity influenced by Marxism and communism. Although liberation theology has grown into an international and interdenominational movement, it began as a movement within the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America in the 50s to 60s. Liberation theology arose principally as a moral reaction to the poverty, caused by social injustice in that region. Interesting also that this is where, before the Jesuits were disbanded, this is the area in which they made their fortunes in Latin America. We Marxists will have to fight side by side in Central America with Marxists who do not believe in God in order to reform a new social society. A pure Central American model. The Jesuits by Malachi Martin. Fidel Castro and his brother began to meet in Mexico City shortly after the US-backed coup in Guatemala to plan the overthrow of the US puppet Bastista regime. Bastista. He was an American puppet. He was receiving the wealth from the Americans. There's a gift of pure gold telephone given to him. It is clear that the counter-terror became the strategy of the Bastista government. It has been estimated by some that as many as 20,000 civilians were killed. At the beginning of 1959, United States companies owned about 40% of the Cuban sugar lands, almost all the cattle ranches, 90% of the mines and minerals concessions, 80% of the utilities, practically all of the oil industry, and supplied 2/3 of Cuba's imports. This is how they work. Bastista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, and here we have from President John F. Kennedy, a quote, administration spokesman publicly praised Bastista, hailed him as a staunch ally and a good friend at a time when he was murdering thousands, destroying the last vestiges of freedom, and stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the Cuban people, and we failed to press for free elections. I believe there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Bastista regime. I approve the proclamation which Fidel Castro made when he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will even go further. To some extent, it is as though Bastista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Bastista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. This is perfectly clear. JFK. Example of CIA-Jesuit collaboration. Manuel Art Time. He was raised a devout Catholic by Jesuits. In 1957 he became a member of the Radical Liberation Party, a Christian democratic group. He graduated as a doctor and planned to become a psychiatrist, so he's quite a clever sort of fellow. Manuel Art Time works with Castro to successfully overthrow Bastista, forms an anti-communist cell group of Catholic youth in Florida, uses several alias names. He goes back to Cuba to assassinate Castro with others. This fails, and he escapes for his life to the Jesuit college, where he's picked up by the CIA and taken back to the USA by plane, and there he is in a picture saluting. It was with President John F. Kennedy. USA fighting Cardinal Spellman's War. Elections throughout the country were to be held in 1956 to establish a unified government. Around 1 million Northerners, mainly minority Catholics, fled south, fearing persecution by communists, following an American propaganda campaign using slogans such as "The Virgin Mary is heading south," and aided by US-funded, which was 93 million, relocation program, all the money they throw at these things, which included ferrying refugees with the 7th Fleet. It is estimated that as many as 2 million more would have left had they not been stopped by the Viet Minh. The northern, mainly Catholic refugees were meant to give Diem a strong anti-communist constituency. Diem later went on to staff his administration's key posts, mainly with northern and central Catholics. Here's this horrific war scene in which we see children running down the street, the soldiers behind them. It's a picture that's vivid in everyone's minds. At about 9 years of age, running down the street, nothing on her, after being severely burned on her back by a South Vietnam napalm attack. The will to live and die. President Diem was a member of the Catholic Vietnamese minority. Jesuits were the first into Vietnam to present Christianity without success. Then, to turn around events, Cardinal Spellman steps in. He also describes Vietnam as a war for civilization and Christ's war against the Viet Cong and the people of North Vietnam. Here we have a Buddhist priest, protesting by burning himself alive. Eastern Europe. 1989 was the night the wall came down. A document by the once Pope John Paul II. In it, he identifies the concept of solidarity with the poor and marginalised as a constitutive element of the gospel and human participation in the common good. It's a Jesuit idea, of course. USA-Vatican alliance. Reagan and the Pope agreed to undertake a clandestine campaign to hasten the dissolution of the communist empire. Solidarity's influence led to the intensification and spread of anti-communist ideals and movements throughout the countries of the Eastern Bloc, weakening their communist governments. On the 4th of June 1989, elections in Poland, where anti-communist candidates won a striking victory, sparked off a succession of peaceful anti-communist revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe, known as the Revolutions of 1989. Solidarity's example was repeated in various ways by opposition groups throughout the Eastern Bloc, eventually leading to the Eastern Bloc's effective dismantling and contributing to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The book The Power and the Glory by David Yallop, Chapter 6, suggests it was a holy alliance that never was. So you can make up your own mind. It's a good reference book though. Now, Carroll was an actor who performed in The Cavalier of the Moon 2 weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War. His contemporaries believed that they had lost a great actor, but his skills displayed at this time would be of great effect later in life. Of course, two actors meeting together, they have a great influence on the world because of their abilities in acting. And all the world wondered after the beast. Time magazine says John Paul superstar. We see a resurgence of this great popularity with the Pope at the moment, Pope Francis. And what did the Bible say? The deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Fulfillment of the prophecy. General Dzerzhinsky may have been planning a military coup since 1980. In the 70s and 80s, tension grew between the people of Poland and its communist government as the rest of the Eastern Bloc, as the influence of the Soviet Union faded. With the advent of perestroika in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev, a chance was open to finally change the system of government after the harsh period of martial law imposed by General Dzerzhinsky. Poland was faced with a civil war. At this time, the Polish nation turned to their church. The government was running the country, but not effectively. But the military coup was a model of efficiency. At midnight, ZOMO, the anti-riot police, ransacked the Solidarity offices in Warsaw, and mass arrests were going on throughout the night. 4,000 people vanished before dawn. The security police provided the militia units with the last known addresses of every Polish citizen, both home and abroad. 1 a.m. the Pope was aroused to the situation by the Polish ambassador to Italy. The Pope was advised that the Church would be expected to play a key role in mediation to eliminate the measure of military intervention as soon as possible. So the papacy was involved in the uprising and then asked to be the mediator. Archbishop Clem spoke in the Jesuit Church of Mary, the patroness of Warsaw. It was a sermon that the army who controlled TV and radio would broadcast several times. Opposition to the decision of authority would cause violent coercion, including bloodshed. The authority considered that the exceptional nature of martial law is dictated by higher necessity. It is the choice of a lesser rather than a greater evil. Assuming the correctness of such reasoning, the man in the street will subordinate himself to the new situation. The Power and the Glory, David Yellop, page 161. In times of war, people fear for their security and are willing to sacrifice civil liberties for the protection of themselves and their country, and patriotism is presented as necessary for the greater good. In a speech at the Brandenburg Gate commemorating the 750th anniversary of Berlin in 1987, Ronald Reagan challenged Mikhail Gorbachev, then the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, to tear down the wall as a symbol of increasing freedom in the Eastern Bloc. So this was an historic event. Ronald Reagan had come a long way. In his early days in acting, he'd been working with the FBI with their concerns of communism infiltrating the movie world. And so he reached to the very heights here with actual participant in the end of the Soviet Union and making the USA the possible only world dominating power together with the Vatican. We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Tear down this wall. And so we have that famous speech, world-changing events. Ronald Reagan, I believe, could well have had good intentions in a lot of the things that he did, and things that shaped his world, that had an influence, could have been treated as any one of us would treat it, except we have the careful guidance of the Spirit of God and we follow His word implicitly. We will not be able to change the course of events because Satan is a cunning deceiver. Things were so shaped in the lives of the Pope and with his own life, fortune telling, his wife involved in this sort of thing, that only clear guidance from God and His holy word would make a difference, that would make his mind open to those things. Each of us are vulnerable to the traps that Satan has for us, that will change world events to his liking rather than to the glory of God. Let us be careful. Priests and American agents, the CIA. Until Solidarity's legal status was restored in 1989, it flourished underground, supplied, nurtured, and advised largely by the network established under the auspices of Ronald Reagan and John Paul II. Tons of equipment, faxes, machines, first in Poland, printing presses, transmitters, telephones, shortwave radios, video cameras, photocopiers, telex machines, computers, word processors were smuggled into Poland via channels established by priests and American agents and representatives of the AFL-CIO and European labour movements. Money for the banned union came from CIA funds, the National Endowment for Democracy, secret accounts in the Vatican, and Western trade unions. Interesting mix here of those involved in supplying the money and means.